So this is just a basic discussion in regards to rotation when it comes to Frost Dual Wield PvP. A tough subject to cover, being that my playstyle might be very different from what is considered the norm. So what I am about to share with you is a video that shows how I approach PvP and what I do for rotation and ability priorities. As you begin to develop a playstyle of your own, eventually with practice you will begin to understand your class more and more, and you will be able to create your own suitable rotation. And with that being said, let's begin. A simple opener for me would be Howling Blast, Death and Decay, Howling Blast times 2, Plague Strike, Chains of Ice, which would give me about 90 plus runic power, which would go towards using Frost Strike, whether it's Killing Machine or not, being that Frost Strikes build up stacks for my blood tap that I can use later on. Now, remember, this is just a basic opener that I would use against enemies without any real detailed strategy. I want to stress that rotation will vary depending on the class you go against. For example, if I were to be fighting a mage, my opener would be much different. It may go something like this: Icy Touch, Chains of Ice, Death Grip, Dark Sim, Death Grip, Howling Blast, Icy Touch, Death and Decay, followed by Plague Strike, with again Frost Strikes to spend my runic power and to get blood tap stacks. And depending on what Dark Sim stills, I would use it to my advantage, whether it's Blink, Mage Armor, Frost Nova, Root. And during that whole chain I would use cooldowns, maybe a silence and any defensive cooldowns I needed. So as you can see, rotation will never be the same all the time. Now let's say I was going against a warrior, my rotation would be something like this: the Asphyxiate Stun, Outbreak, Howling Blast times 3, Death and Decay, Howling Blast, defensive cooldowns if needed, with Frost Strike as needed, and then I gauge the fight from there to see what I would do next. But I would mainly focus on using only spell-based abilities for that rotation for that opener if I get it first. Another thing I wanted to mention was that each class will vary heavily based on who gets the first opener. Like I said with the warrior, if I get the opener first, that would be what I would do for the starting rotation. But if he were to get the opener first on me, my so-called rotation would be much different. I like to mention that the general idea of a standalone rotation can change depending on the armor class or even spec. This is why it is vital to utilize all of your available abilities, such as Necrotic Strike, Dark Sim, tier talents, defensive abilities, and so on. So I just wanted to explain my simpler approach to encountering cloth and plate armor classes when it comes to rotation and ability priority. For example, cloth, I begin with a basic opener depending on the class, so I will most likely use a lot of Icy Touch dispels. This would be the only time that I would use Obliterate with Killing Machine proc only. Any melee physical ability should be viable on cloth, but as dual wield, don't rely too heavily on Obliterate or other physical abilities all the time. If Frost Strike isn't available, then Obliterate should suffice only if Killing Machine is procced. So as for plate, I would use much more spell based abilities and I would only use Frost Strike. I never would use or rarely use Obliterate against plate due to the physical damage mitigation. Whether it's a healer or a DPS class, I try to avoid using any major physical special abilities on plate. There is only one exception for me to use Obliterate on plate, and that is if I'm fighting against another Death Knight and they have anti-magic barrier enabled. I will use Obliterate only with Killing Machine proc only, and this is just to put some damage on him since all my other abilities would be absorbed by the shield. But that is probably the only time I would use it. There is some other exceptions, but those get into a little bit more detail. Well, now that I've opened the Pandora's box of Frost Strike and Obliterate, this would probably be the ideal time for me to just cover these two abilities. As dual wield, you will focus more on Frost Strikes, whereas two-handers would probably use more Obliterate. This is because dual wield you will stack mastery in terms will help with the Frost Strike damage, as well as we get a perk that increases our Frost Strike damage by an additional 40%. Obliterate hits very weak for our class when you're dual wielding and is only viable on maybe cloth. So try not to use it too often or at all unless you're in a certain situation like I mentioned previously against Death Knight classes and so on. But with Frost Strike it will hit both cloth and plate armor classes equally. That is because it is a spell based attack and it isn't mitigated by armor unlike Obliterate. So I hope that kinda helps clear up some questions in regards to why these two abilities are different for each class. A Frost Strike would be mainly a dual wield talent and Obliterate would be a main two-handed talent. So now to sum it up, the only way you can really learn rotation is to understand your class and its functionality. Learning the mechanics of how your class works is really helpful. Practice and more practice are the key. You could always ask for advice against certain classes, and by helping each other you can improve. and you'll begin to notice that your rotation will change day in and day out the more you practice and make progress. I know this video may not have been too helpful, but I hope it does answer some questions some people may have when they've been asking me. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and again, thanks for watching.